Capitalism, History's Gift to Philanthropy. Well, welcome to this presentation. Who am I, and why should you listen to what I have to say about this topic? Capitalism, or for-profit business market-based activity, which is a manifestation of capitalism, as a gift from history to philanthropy. Well, as you will see, my proposition is that history, which I define as the changing evolution and nature of things over time, has given us two gifts. Philanthropy is as much a gift from history as capitalism, and is actually the much older of the two, as you'll see in a moment. And the specific proposition I'm going to advance in this presentation is that the two, philanthropy and capitalism, are linked together in a very specific sense and are best conceptualized in our mind's eye as two major component parts of a unified system that enables communities to function optimally when the two are in balance. That's a mouthful, I know, but in the available time, I'm going to do my best to unpack it all, starting with a brief bio, and then I'll jump right into the topic. Well, my professional biography is on TANGO's webpage, and I'll talk about TANGO in a moment. So if you want the bio, you can find it there. But all you really need to know is that I'm a lawyer, and I practice both nonprofit and business law for 36 years. And I've also served on the boards of directors of nonprofits and for-profit organizations. So I have boots on the ground, practical experience in both of the sectors. And I joined TANGO, the Alliance for Nonprofit Growth and Opportunity, in 2016 to develop educational and other content for our nonprofit members. TANGO is a co-op or an informal partnership platform of sorts that really endeavors to build links between the business sector and the nonprofit sector. Businesses can join TANGO as a partner at an annual cost, but nonprofits can join for free right off of our webpage. No gimmicks or anything hidden. Signing up will just put you in the middle of our information flow of newsletters and other content. So if you like what you hear today, please think about signing up and joining TANGO. Now, with that said, like most of you, I am one of those people who has had a lifelong, deeply personal interest in what I'll call the nature of the human condition, how it is we encounter living in the world, and especially, but not exclusively, in the context of the hardships and the sufferings that seem at times to be permanently woven into the human condition throughout time as we know it. You know, disabilities, poverty, crime, addiction, injustice, disease, homelessness. I don't need to describe what I mean any further because you know what I mean. It's called life. And I'm not here to deliver a sermon or to delve into these issues in any way other than to make the observation that these things are, by and large, the everyday bread and butter of what much of the nonprofit sector does. These human problems and conditions are what nonprofits tend to address in some manner, shape, or form. This is the world of Section 501c3 charitable organizations. And they each have a specific way of doing so that they craft into their mission statement, such as the mission to assist people with disabilities or to guide them out of the throes of addiction. This is what makes the nonprofit field so fascinating to me. And even as I say this, I acknowledge that the nonprofit sector includes the arts and education and related activities, which go not to addressing sufferings of some type, but to better the human condition, perhaps to enable it to better understand its sufferings. Look at it this way. If you look at it this way, the Greek roots of the word make sense. Philo means love in Greek, Old Greek, and anthropy means humankind. So philanthropy means the love of humankind. And with that said, let me start to try to define the term philanthropy more specifically, and as I will be using it in this presentation. And let me start to do this by asking you to look at the slide appearing on the screen, in which I've inserted 3 circles, blue, red, and yellow, with each circle, as its content says, designated to represent one of the 3 sectors into which we commonly divide the activities and functions of our culture and our economy. There's the private sector in blue on the left, the governmental or public sector on the far right in the yellow circle, and the nonprofit sector or philanthropy in the red circle in the middle. Now, I'm going to come back to the 3 sectors analytically a little bit later, but for now, all I want you to focus on and to think about is the red circle, which designates the set of all things that I fit within my definition of the term philanthropy. And let me tell you what I include in that definition in the circle. I'm basically saying that it includes the world of Section 501c3 organizations we see around us every day and that we recognize from our life experiences. Homelessness, social justice, healthcare, colleges, universities are all within the circle. Also included in the circle are major donors and grant makers like foundations, private and public. Now, I dare say that what I just said to you about what goes in the red circle is not new, because if you're attending this conference or listening to this video, you're probably already involved in the sector in some way and recognize what I'm putting in the red circle. But to do justice to my topic, which is at a deeper level, that is the relationship between capitalism and philanthropy, we need to dig a little bit deeper than the description of what's in the circle. We need to look at its history, like where did it come from? Why is there philanthropy? Why do we have a nonprofit sector? Why does Section 501c3 even exist? Well, a simplified and quick answer to these questions is that organizations of which I speak, what's in that red circle, began to appear over 1,000 years ago. That's a long time, back in medieval England, from a combination of the raw cultural material of the day of Christian charity on the one hand, and I'll talk about that in a second, and the then emerging legal tradition of individual liberty and property rights in England. English law is really important because our legal system is based on and derived from English law. And the history is important because if you look at, and this is the point I want to get at, if you look at the history going forward from the time of the collapse of Rome in the year 496 or so, the civil government just collapsed. And what resulted in Europe was a tug of war for hundreds of years thereafter. On the one hand, there was the Catholic Church, which was the only institution still standing when the Roman government fell. On the one hand, the church. On the other hand, there were the monarchs and principalities that emerged over the continent and eventually evolved into today's modern nation states. And this tug of war was over control of both spiritual and civil matters, a church and state struggle because there wasn't separation of church and state. Think about that for a minute, in a sense of how intertwined all of the affairs can actually be in your life if you've got a body of canon law and canon courts that run parallel to the king's law and the king's courts. And even though we've separated, there are vestiges of the struggle that we see today, such as in the fact that you can have a church wedding or a civil ceremony. It's the same underlying concept. But the point I'm getting at, and we repeat this, is that if they were intertwined for a long time, the civil authority and the church and Christianity, as they pulled apart and separated like this, right, the concept of charity that originated on the Christian side was left embedded in and became a part of the civil law of the state. There were monarchs at the time, but the same difference, right? And those concepts that came from the religious side are firmly embedded in the law today. we have church-state separation, but not charity-state separation. I guess that's one way to look at it. And to emphasize the importance of this, I want to refer you to the year 1601, well before America was formed, at the end of the reign of Elizabeth I, when Shakespeare was finishing up his plays. At that time, the English Parliament approved a statute called the Statute of Charitable Uses. Now, uses is an anachronistic term. Substitute the modern word purposes and you'll get it. The Statute of Charitable Purposes. And that statute wrote these charitable principles and definitions firmly into the law back then, and that same law was carried over by the colonists, and it eventually became part of American law. So, in American law, in each of the 50 states, you will find a modern version of this statute from 1601. It's still on the books, folks. And I want to call out this history to make the point that this nonprofit or philanthropic system that we developed for taking care of people and the like, or evolved organically as part of the human, as part of the cultural, legal, and economic evolution in England and in America. It was not the result of any central planning or government initiative. Maybe I'm wrong, but on a personal side, the personal side of things, I find the historical development of this system to be a significant reason to believe in the merits of this philanthropic system, because it's withstood the test of time. And it speaks to the constant nature of the problems of the human condition I spoke with earlier, which are still with us, that were with us in 1601, which are with us in 2021, and which we put in the mission statements of our nonprofit philanthropic organizations. Now it's time to move on. If philanthropy and its history are what I put in the red thought circle on this slide, let's now hop on over to the blue slide in capitalism. It's a private sector thing, as you'll see in a second. So, capitalism as a gift from history to philanthropy, the private sector. Let me start this discussion by pointing out that capitalism is much younger than philanthropy. Now, the economics as an academic discipline didn't even exist until the late 1700s and early 1800s. And it emerged in the midst of rapidly evolving political systems and changes. There was the American Revolution and the French Revolution. There were new killer apps that came online, like steam engines, telegraphs, railroads. All that led to the Industrial Revolution, leading up to that three-sector modern economy of today. And I've always interpreted this historical sequence, that philanthropy preceded capitalism, to have some meaning in itself, in the sense that the history first gave us philanthropy and its basic moral tenets and principles, a requirement that we address common aspects of the human condition, that we have duties to attend to things that are more than our own self-interest, and that we ought to have a simultaneous interest in the well-being of others and in the community on many different levels. This philanthropic thought was already, how should I say it, locked in place to some extent in the culture when capitalism came onto the scene. And I suspect that this was better for the world than it would have been the other way around if capitalism had developed and philanthropy had to find its way onto the table afterwards. But with that said, let me put the slide back up and define the term capitalism as I will be using it. I define philanthropy carefully and with its history. Let me kind of take a similar tact and look at what's in the blue circle on the slide. Capitalism is a system of organized and interacting principles and practices in the world, the purpose of which is to create wealth and value where it did not exist before. Its principles and practices include individual freedoms of the First Amendment type to choose to engage in an activity of your choice for this purpose, to create a business, You have property rights into what your enterprise produces, its profits and its value in the market. And there's also the rule of law, which means that the government will be there to protect and enforce your rights. Another fundamental principle that comes into play here is that of markets, and as opposed to central planning. The argument is that markets are the best way to foster innovation and advancements because of competition. The blocking and tackling you have to do to stay ahead in business is valuable to you, even as it threatens you and makes you work harder. The thought is that there is collective wisdom in the markets, people making decisions about what to buy and from whom and at what price. These are the things that drive innovation and enhance value in the market. Now, there are a couple things that I didn't include in the definition just now that you might have been expecting, especially in our heated political climate. For example, that an accusation that capitalism is unfair and oppressive, that it favors and enriches the few and the rich at the expense of the poor and the like, and that greed prevails or is enabled by capitalism. I don't include any of that stuff in my definition because I'm defining the system, the wealth-creating principles, the algorithm, based on freedom and property rights, separate and apart from the capitalists themselves, the human beings who are capitalists or not, because human beings are separate things. And I'll tell you, there are greedy capitalists and there are generous capitalists, just as there are greedy socialists and generous socialists. And, oh, by the way, there are a lot of jealous and envious people, too. But the point is that you need to separate the system in your mind, the capitalist system, the wealth-creating algorithm, which in itself is value neutral. It's not normative. It doesn't prescribe a type of behavior, right? It can be used for good or ill depending on the virtue or vice of the people involved. But let's put the virtue and the vice aside for this discussion and focus on the machine that produces wealth. And let me also say that I'm not endorsing unbridled capitalism. I mean, the conditions in the 1800s in coal mines with child labor and textile mills were just horrific. But we've advanced beyond that. But I just want to make that clear, that I'm not saying that I'm advocating for a complete laissez-faire system. I'm talking about a system of capitalism that has reasonable regulations on it. But let's put that aside. There are two other notions about capitalism that I want to make before getting to the interlinking or interconnection between capitalism and philanthropy. And the first is that when you look at this topic, you have to acknowledge that there's always been, at deep levels of Western culture, an antipathy to wealth-creating activities and to the rich. Even as most people who share the antipathy towards wealth would be happy to have more of it themselves, people often just dislike the rich. Well, because they're rich. Maybe it's envy of a certain type, I don't know. But this thinking goes way back in our culture. I've researched it, and as best I can tell, it goes as far back as ancient Greek, when certain type of activities, such as the get your hands dirty pursuits to provide food, make money, or to create an enterprise, were regarded as less wholesome or pure than intellectual pursuits. And there's even, vestiges of this, I guess you would call it, hostility to wealth in the New Testament admonition that wealth isn't what gets you into heaven, and that mercy and compassion are owed to the less fortunate. This is all part of the cultural background too, an antipathy to wealth. And the second notion is that there's always been, as part of the same tradition, this metaphysical notion that the amount of wealth in the world is fixed in some manner, which means that the only way you get rich is by making someone else poor. If I gain, then you lose. I want to address both of these notions. The first, higher pursuits versus lesser pursuits, that capitalism is somehow innately grubby or dirty, is just an outdated prejudice. Capitalism, working to create and operate a business profitably, is an honorable and morally positive activity. It can be described as a moral calling. It is hard and difficult work to create and build a business, and we should celebrate and praise those among us who do so successfully. We need people who are able and willing to create wealth by building out profitable enterprises. I don't have time to go into this precise point in any more detail today, but I highly recommend a book written by a lay Catholic theologian, Michael Novak, passed away 8 or 9 years ago. The book is called Business as a Calling. It is one of the most influential books of my lifetime, and I've given away probably over 50 copies to friends over the years. It explains how building a business, creating wealth, giving employment opportunities to people is a morally serious and praiseworthy activity, period. And I'm also here to tell you that the second notion, that wealth creation is a zero-sum game, gets political play, but it's false. Wealth is created spontaneously. It's what some thinkers described as an emergent phenomena from the creative activity in the market of entrepreneurs. And there are no natural limits on the amount of wealth in the world. The wealth that entrepreneurs create is new wealth. Think of it this way. Look at the total value represented by, let's say, the market capitalization of Amazon. That value, Amazon, was created from whole cloth. It didn't exist before 1995 when Jeff Bezos started it as an online bookstore. Look, love it or hate it, I'm not going to defend all that Amazon is or does by any stretch. But my point is, it's an entirely new system of great value in the market that we all have benefited from, especially as we've seen throughout the pandemic. So, with my definitions of philanthropy and capitalism behind us, let me now circle back to close in on the purpose of this presentation by explaining how capitalism is a gift to philanthropy and how philanthropy is really a gift right back to capitalism. And I'm going to do this on 2 levels. The first is what I'll call a mechanical level, by demonstrating the connections that keep the system working, the links between the blue circle and the red circle and even the yellow circle. And then, second, by looking at wealth per se. I was getting at this a moment ago, but the point I want to emphasize is that without wealth, philanthropy would fail as a system. So it's good to have a system, like capitalism, that creates wealth if you are active in the nonprofit sector. Now, let's start with what I just referred to as the mechanical level that connects philanthropy and capitalism. Let me put up slide number 2. This is the same slide as number 1, but I've added some information to it that you can read in the words added below each of the circles. You may remember that earlier in this talk, I referred to these 3 circles as the 3 sectors into which we conceptually break down economy and culture. And with the blue circle on the far left, as I've said before, houses the private or business sector. And as the words I added below the circle indicate, this is where we as individuals live and where businesses, capitalist organizations, also reside. To be clear, if you didn't know it, you are a member of the private sector. Then, on the far right is the yellow circle. And as the words I've added below the circle indicate, it represents the governmental sector, the federal, state, and local government and their various branches and agencies. They all operate for a public purpose. They are public sector organizations who exist to fulfill a public purpose. The blue circle, which I previously mentioned, exists to fulfill the purposes and needs of the people and businesses within the private sector. But then, let's come right back down to the slide in the middle, the picture in the middle, the red circle, the red thought circle that represents the nonprofit or philanthropic sector. And it's in the middle of the other 2 circles for a reason. And that reason starts with the word hybrid, which I use on the slide. because philanthropy is a hybrid in the sense that it shares aspects with both the blue and the yellow circles. It functions really as a mediating presence or influence between the private sector, the hardball, full-tackle world of making money, and the purely public and political nature of what government does. To this end, look below the red circle where you'll see the words public charitable purpose. And then you'll see that there is also an arrow connecting these words to the public sector. And I do that because I want you to understand that the public/charitable purposes that are involved in the world of philanthropy are of the same nature as the public purposes government serves. The government, the yellow arrow I indicated, is meant to show this similarity, this similarity of purpose between the nonprofits and the government. But on the other hand, if you look further down below the red circle, you'll see the words private control and private money, and a blue arrow linking these words to the private sector in the blue circle. Let me take them one at a time to explain the mechanical connection here. Private control has a precise meaning. It means the people who serve on the governing boards of directors of these organizations are there as private individuals, not as public officials. They act as fiduciaries, and they have control over the nonprofit organization as it exists and as it strives to fulfill the public purpose in its charitable mission, which, as I just explained with the yellow arrow, links the nonprofit sector into the yellow circle. So we've got an intermediate sector that has aspects of both of the other two baked right into it. Now, another word on this slide that further links capitalism to philanthropy is the term private money. As you see, I have inserted it under the yellow circle. Right? This means, and this is where the wealth comes from, right? This is where wealth comes from, which means that private persons can donate their money on a tax-favored basis, deductible donations, to be used under the governance of a board of directors of private individuals, but to fulfill a public purpose. That purpose being what is stated in the mission statement. There's a lot to absorb here. I can send you more information about this if you'd like, but the basic concept, again, is that philanthropy exists in the world, in this space, very closely linked to the private sector and capitalism on one hand, and also linked to the public sector in the sense that it has to perform things that benefit the public. But on the money issue again, and this is what I want to close with. Money is like oxygen. I'm stealing that phrase from someone at NANOE, I know. But I'm stealing it and I'm using it because it's true. And that is, it takes wealth to do charity, period. We all know this. Nothing to be embarrassed about. And there's no reason to be embarrassed about looking for more money to fulfill your mission and grow your organization. And moreover, it is the private sector where capitalism resides that value in the marketplace is created, and that is why the private sector is so darn important to philanthropy. Government can redistribute wealth, it can print money, but it can't do what the private sector does, and that is create new wealth that enables everyone in society to do better. The best explanation of this wealth-creating relationship between capitalism and philanthropy that I've ever read is on page 141 of that book, Business as a Calling, that I described earlier. And the quote is from the former chairman and chief executive officer of Coca-Cola, Roberto Goizueta, if I pronounced it properly, and he said the following: Given that billions of shares of publicly held companies are owned by foundations, universities, and the like, one should never forget the multiplier effect in the world of philanthropy and the benefit to society that each dollar increase in value of those shares brings about. If a foundation owns, say, 50 million shares of Coca-Cola stock, for each dollar that our stock price increases, that foundation will be required to give out an additional 2.5 million. Now, what he's referring to here is that most nonprofits have what's called a 5% spending rate. So if there's $50 million in the endowment, they would normally spend at a rate of $2.5 million a year off of that. But the point they're making is that the ship rises in both directions when capitalist organizations are successful. Well, one last closing thought. I understand that, a lot of nonprofits don't have big endowments, and the thought of having millions of dollars of Coke shares is very remote to them. But it doesn't change the underlying analysis of the importance of capitalism and philanthropy. And I will say this, talk to the people at NANOE, because they're very tuned into this thought system, and they have a turbocharged system for helping you learn to raise money. Money is like oxygen, and you should do your best to raise it to fulfill the charitable purpose of your organization. Thank you very much. I hope I provided you with a better understanding of this material. And again, let me close with a pitch for TANGO, the Alliance for Nonprofit Growth and Opportunity, reminding you that nonprofits can join at no cost. So feel free to sign up and put yourself into our information system. Thank you.